Good morning. I'm Maurice Crespi, Managing Partner of Schindler's Attorneys. Schindler's Attorneys is the co-founder of Cobra. Cobra is a consortium that was formed between Schindler's Attorneys, IQ Business, and Engaged Business Turnaround. We now have over 55 partners who've joined. Idea is that they contribute with their expertise, assist businesses wherever possible on a pro bono basis if the business needs it and cannot afford the services. We provide a knowledge base on our website. You can find that on www.cobra.org.za. And we also have these webinars and private Zoom sessions that we can arrange with you and your team. So yeah, what we also do is we provide these webinars to the public. They're insightful. We have them every single day. And today our webinar is a second webinar that we're hosting in relation to the situation in the restaurant business. And there's been quite a bit of activity in the sector. We've seen that there have been protests of late. And to understand the situation better, we have various guests, various panelists, starting with Wendy Alberts, who's really behind the movement to try and lift the restrictions, to try and ease the burden when it comes to the trade, the restaurant trade. Wendy is the Chief Executive Officer of Restaurants Association of South Africa, and she's won the CEO Global Country and Regional Award, as well as Africa's most influential woman in government and business. She also sits on the Tourism Grading Council Awards Committee. RASA is a leading organization in the food and beverage sector that aims to uplift and self-regulate the restaurant industry in South Africa. Since its formation 4 years ago, under Albert's leadership, it has grown to be a powerful association that partners with top blue chip companies, suppliers, industry associations, and players, including various high-level employees in government departments. We then have Grant Hallowell, who's also Director of Engaged Business Turnaround, one of the founding partners. He's joined us today because he has expertise. He's been in the restaurant trade for in excess of 20 years. So he's a turnaround specialist and he's been in the business. So it'll be interesting to hear from him in relation to ideas and pivoting ideas and the like, and what they're actually doing on the ground in assisting restaurants. We then have Sean Barber, who's the founder and CEO of the Rockets Group. Sean is renowned restaurateur in Johannesburg. He's been super successful. He's been a friend of mine for several years. He now finds himself in the same predicament as everybody else. And then we have the Fowles. They're bakers and the owner of Need Bakery. Need started as a family artisan bakery cafe in August 2006 in Wembley Square in Cape Town. Today they have 13 stores across Cape Town and Gauteng. So it'll also be good to hear what's happening south of Gauteng. So I'm going to ask the panelists to please turn their videos on, and I'm going to kick off with you, Wendy. You put your mic and video on. There we go. Whilst we get to Wendy, I'll also introduce the remaining panelists. We have Emma Marseille, IQ Business. Emma is, there we go, I can see you, Wendy. I'm just going to, before I hand over to you, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce Emma from IQ Business. We have Peter Gordon. He's a business turnaround specialist at Engaged Business Turnaround. We have Renee Klopper, who is also from IQ Business, and Gary Berkowitz, who is from Schindler's Attorneys. Thanks so much, Wendy, for joining us. We really appreciate it. There's been a lot of activity of late. There's been probably the highest degree of activism in the industry, in the history of South Africa. So let's just start off by asking you to give us your take on the state of affairs, the situation, and where you believe that this is going to go.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invite, and hi to all my friends and colleagues around the table. Definitely yesterday has lent itself to an interesting day. We outlined the Seats on the Street campaign. It certainly got us all the exposure we needed. It certainly gave us the voice that needed to be brought to the attention of government. I think two parts that I really enjoyed is one, it outlined the gracious behavior of our restaurants, that we are people of standard and stature, integrity, and we had this peaceful protest and we managed to certainly advocate our voice. And the second part, we certainly got the attention of one, the consumer, which was really important. We've had feedback that lots and lots of consumers came back into our restaurants to enjoy a meal, and I think that's one of the challenges is looking at ways to maneuver consumer behavior. We also got the attention of the president. He responded to our letter last night. So kudos to everybody who was involved in the process. Thanks to Sean. He was amazing. He opened up his restaurant and his hospitality. We had the minister come in to join us on the streets of Parkhurst, so it was lovely. She was very humbled and I think very kind and compassionate to the state of the industry. I think she could certainly see in the eyes and the voices of people and all the messages, and I think through all the social media campaign and the build up to it, how devastated the industry truly is. So we had a further Zoom meeting with her through the afternoon, and I think that there definitely is a sense of urgency to engage with us to lift the liquor ban, which is critical to the business, amongst some other issues which we can elaborate on later. And I think the key thing now is to obviously continue with momentum. So we've got to now keep doing 1 million tweets on the tweet streets and the Facebook streets, and keep tweeting the president's office and in KDZ's office, and still looking at finding traction for them to take us seriously. So well done to everybody who was involved. The industry's frail. We've got massive closures happening, lots and lots of retrenchments. We've gone from a 7 billion industry down to a 1 billion industry. Estimates are around about 70% permanent retrenchments on 800,000 employees. We're looking at probably 400,000 to 500,000 permanent retrenchments. It's imminent times. I've got a new report which just came in this morning, which says that there are 15,772 permanently shut down restaurants across South Africa. So I do need to validate the document that was sent to me today, but if this is certainly the state, then we're in a far worse position than what we had anticipated. So lots of aspects that need to be taken care of. We also need to raise a lot of issues which we raised with the minister. I think a couple of things that we made key yesterday is that you can't be in charge of the health industry and you're not consulting with restaurants and making decisions on behalf of our expertise without having proper consultation. We also challenged a lot of the data that's been put out there. Things like the liquor ban is put together because we're filling up the hospitals. Restaurants have had no ability to serve alcohol at this time, so we are certainly not part of that. And if the statistics right now show that the reason for putting the alcohol ban in place is because of irresponsibility, pull the stats pre-COVID, and let's rather let restaurants be the people that serve alcohol, because we certainly know how to do it. We really need to explore the landlords and the leases and look at ways to maneuver a directive with government in terms of bringing equality to all outlets within shopping centres. So what we do know is that the anchor tenants within shopping centres pay a percentage rental. We also need to push for a directive to give us that relief, because I think if we're all working from a place of equality on the financial deposits that we've got, we can certainly find ways to rebuild our businesses. Curfew, we certainly outlined the curfew to have that lifted. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. We've asked for interprovincial travel to be lifted. I think that will certainly bring more people into many restaurants, and those restaurants that are really struggling on those belts. We've asked for relief on the liquor licenses, SAMRO, SAMPRA, UIF, TERS, which they've given to us yesterday, the day before yesterday, the announcement was made. And then obviously the engagements with the banks to lift the lending criteria, to look at mechanisms to bring cash flow into the business and affordable payback structures for us. And the same thing obviously on the back end with the landlords. Imminent for us is obviously a recovery fund and a recovery plan that we need to have further engagements with government. And I'm looking at putting up a task team to work with certain stakeholders. I think we had a brilliant team around the table yesterday who can certainly give a lot of input in the relief that we're looking for and the components we need to rebuild the industry. So I think that will probably cover it from our side for the moment.
You mentioned that the president had written to you, had responded last night. What was said?
They acknowledge our proposal, so we certainly put a very feasible proposal to lift the liquor ban, not only for restaurants, but to lift the liquor ban on a national basis. And we need to have consultation engagement to unpack that proposal and look at clever people around the table who can certainly bring the structures in place to make it a feasible option. So they acknowledged it, and they certainly acknowledged the urgency. So we trust that the urgency is not the same approach that President Ramaphosa took on the 24th of May, where he said he understands the hardships, and we're sitting on the 24th of July almost. And is that hardship? Because waiting June, July, 2 months to acknowledge hardship, that is not a time frame that we need. We did highlight to the minister yesterday, a day in our restaurant lives is like a year in her life. Every day that we wait is more critical to the industry, and it's another fall of fatality of one of our restaurants, staff, as well as all the value-added people that and service providers that rely heavily on the financial support of each business that gets closed.
Now, you say government's been receptive, but do you find that there's resistance in any sector, any lobby groups? Is there a degree of resistance to the proposals?
Absolutely. If we look at it, the last 5 weeks have been a complete decimation of the avoidance to completely and calculatedly engage with us. I think it's been very irresponsible on government's part to, one, not give us proper directive on to who to talk to, and then not make that cabinet available to have these discussions. 5 weeks have certainly been the most important, viable time for us, because it certainly was a time where we could have mobilized the consumers. And I think the month longer without consumers being in our business has certainly frightened them away with the wave coming in, as well as all the restrictions placed on the restaurants and the confusion. What is the timing? Can you, can't you? Who's open, who's not? Serve alcohol, don't serve alcohol, buy alcohol, can't drink it. So I think all the disruption that has been brought through the chaos of the restrictions has hurt us immensely in terms of the consumer mobilizing themselves to come back into our restaurants. We've had absolutely no joy from Patel's office. We've had no joy whatsoever from the Minister of Cobra. She's absolutely thrown a deaf ear. On the 7th day, on the 11th hour, Minister Patel wrote back saying, sorry, you're in the wrong cabinet, you need to go back to Cobra. And we'd been in Cobra for 2 weeks negotiating, so we were there. Why don't you just deal with all the critical issues that we were talking about? Whilst we've got the support of the Minister of Tourism, her mandate is completed. There's nothing further more she can do than hand over the memorandums out of courtesy for us, because the responsibility of labour, liquor and curfew doesn't sit within her portfolio to make those decisions.
Just an observation to be made, which is quite interesting. You're not getting support. The industry is not getting support by government, which is the executive arm of the state. But if you actually move to the judiciary, when it came to, are you familiar with the Mazepeli Plaka judgment that was handed down? And in that case, there's a lockdown, and the court held that the restaurants were still liable to pay their employees in circumstances where there's the vis maior, an act of God. Now, that judgment was criticized in a labor court judgment by Judge Van Niekerk, but the fact of the matter is it stands there as precedent. And in that case, the employees placed the company into business rescue because they were deemed to be creditors, which, if one follows the labor court judgment, they would not have been recognized as creditors in relation to that period. Are you aware of that? Do you have any comments in relation to now the fact that now the judiciary isn't helping, and then one moves over to insurance, and then you have the headache of insurance? You guys are getting battered from every angle.
From the onset, 20 weeks. There hasn't been one single day that we're fighting for something. So, when we closed down, we handled the restriction, and we had the curfew on the liquor. Then it was curfew on the numbers, and there was a confusion. And in that very devastating time, it was chaos for everybody. So everybody did what they needed to do, and we needed to put these safety protocols in place. And it was a real moment of chaos and looking for these solutions to understand what was happening with this world-changing event that was going to take place to completely end the world almost. And in that space, we constantly looked, and police brutality at that time was very critical. They were coming in and raiding our restaurants, and at no fault of any of our restaurateurs, because we're not criminals. Just because there was complexity in terms of the inability to communicate effectively. Then we got shut down completely, and then we were lobbying to please open our restaurants. So I think in hindsight, if we look back, we're probably the only country that was closed down from the start, not allowing takeaways and deliveries. Where we've been allowed takeaways and deliveries, our position would be much better. And I think the next part would have been if they had engaged with the landlords in a functional relationship to have adjusted the leases and the rentals to sort of best practice syndrome that works with shopping centers, anchor tenants, and ourselves. We could have saved a lot more businesses and pushed that on the back end to the finance houses and obviously pension funds. So those engagements were never taken place. And although we've been raising all these issues from the onset, then it was quick where, you know, a lot of restaurants foolishly cancelled their policies because there was this desperation to cut back on all your expenses to save your businesses, because many insurance companies had announced that they simply wouldn't pay out on the luxury policies of business interruption that many of our restaurants had been paying years for. And then there was a cancellation and the adjustment to policies and policy rewording and a whole fiasco that we were dealing with and putting pressure on that space. Almost 18 weeks ago, we asked the minister to intervene and to hold meetings with the insurance companies to support the industry in getting those payouts done. That also just fell to deaf ears, and so did the landlords. So whilst they gave us a directive to hand to the landlords, we certainly had a great moratorium that was put together with the Shopping Centre Council and SAPOA in terms of giving us relief that we could negotiate a global negotiation with all other tenants. But it was really just a guideline. It wasn't directive. So it meant nothing for anybody within the industry. And what we've seen is there are some landlords who have been incredibly amazing in supporting our restaurants, and other landlords who are demanding full rentals plus utilities plus increases plus. So the fragmentation of the irregularities within the industry have really been expensive to us in costing us our businesses. And these are real issues that we've had to look at. The UIF paying out 4 months later, TERS has been complicated, fighting to get the extension on TERS, getting a task team set up with the UIF to get it done, the fraud within UIF. I mean, we were on the forefront of the fraud. I mean, 2 of our restaurants got paid out over 4 million rand, and the money never reached them. And it took them 3 weeks to uncover the fraud. So we've seen that timing is not critical in the urgency of anything with regards to our business. And I think, you know, one thing I've been thinking about over the last couple of days is the true collapse has come because there's an inability to understand the frame model of the restaurants. We are not like a shopping center or a retail outlet that just simply, you know, has a lease, pays rent, has staff, and has a product that we sell at a markup. There are all these other complex issues that come in. We've got these massive taxes that we pay, liquor licenses, SAMRO, SAMPRA, SABC. We've got cost of sales, we've got administration, we've got staff, we've got staff on UIF, we've got frontline staff that aren't paid. And the entire business model hasn't really been analysed by anybody that sits within government to look at a functional way to support us. And if we had, on the onset, dealt with the landlords, there would have been one real issue that would have sorted itself out, because the cumulative debt wouldn't have raised itself to the level of what it is, forcing so many businesses to go into liquidation and close.
You know, I think you were quoted in the press in an article that I read last night. And there's a very important point that it's obvious, but it hadn't occurred to me. And that is that the restaurant industry is probably one of the most important industries, because it doesn't only provide employment, but there's a skills ladder. I think it was a quote somewhere in one of the publications. So in other words, you start out as a waiter and you move up the ladder, and now that's been lost. So it's not only the trade, it's not only the jobs, but it's also the skill set that were available or was available to the public.
You know, if we look at the way that staff is rebated in our restaurants, one, we've got the frontline staff who are commission earners. The second level is obviously our minimum wage employees, our kitchen staff, supervisors, management, and obviously owners. So there's so many different scales of employment that come into our business model. And a large percentage of our staff are frontline staff that earn tips, and they're generously paid. So some of our staff have recorded good sort of entry-level opportunities of being part of the workforce, which allows them to have qualified for lending criteria, to have purchased cars or homes, or pay for their kids' tuition, or go to university or studying, or the amount of students that we've got that rely on tips to put them through university. That is a whole breadline that has been lost, and that whole landscape of beautiful people that work in the front line that have been trying to improve their lifestyles have now had to take many steps back that have worked so hard for it. And these are, for me, the heartbreaking stories. You know, when people phone me and they say, I'm studying a law degree and I simply don't have money to afford it, I've been kicked out of university. Or I don't have, I'm a waitress and my mother's on medication that I really need to purchase, and I do not have any form of income to support us. So there's been this massive prejudice of the frontline staff within our restaurant sector that's now gone from earning an average of 15,000 Rand a month to applying for a grant of 350 Rand, who stand to lose everything in the life cycle that they've used to improve their status.
Wendy, you know, shows like this are really, really important, because once again, it hadn't occurred to me, you know, at university, I mean, most of our friends would work at Spur to fund the university and to get their pocket money, and now that's not available. I want to move to Grant. Wendy's spoken quite a bit around the leases and the landlords. Just to remind the audience, Grant's a business rescue practitioner. He has experience in the restaurant trade. What I want to ask is, what's going on the ground? You're dealing with landlords on a daily basis. What's happening?
Thanks, Maurice, and thanks, Wendy. Welcome to our webinar. I will be open and honest here. We're actually having quite a positive impact with the landlords on the ground at the moment. So, I mean, Evan and Sean from Rockets, just two casing points here where we have been engaging with landlords. The response from the landlord has actually been quite positive, and there is a willing to work with us. So the willingness is there. We've obviously gone in, our stand plan of attack here, Maurice, is to go in with what we refer to as a facilitative versus evaluative mediation approach. So in going in with this, we actually take cognizance of the fact that the landlord's also in a massive amount of trouble. He himself has staff to pay, banks to pay. He's got bonds. They've got problems. So by taking all these considerations, we actually reach let's call it an amicable middle ground. And a large percentages of our deals have been done on the back of a variable model. So obviously we've got the ability to, let's say, declare April and May rentals down to effectively a naught. And then moving on from June, July, August, and September, going on a going forward basis, as Wendy says, when we get operational again with the restaurants, is to almost say that your utilities, so your lights and water, we go in with a negotiation that is 100% the restaurant's reliance and ability to pay. You can't walk away from that. And then we work on a variable model on the rest of the deal to say, we will show you what the restaurant is making. We're happy to show the value and then reach some form of amicable solution from a value perspective to say, this is how much we can pay in that month. Some of our deals that we've done, Maurice, we've actually renegotiated on a month-to-month basis. So each month we'll show landlord, this is where our profit line is, this is what we're able to do. And again, to repeat what Wendy says is, with the goalposts moving every 5 days at the moment, now back into a curfew, which one of my biggest pain points is the government of ours and restaurants at a 7 o'clock threshold. So we can abide by all the rules and the laws of sanitizing the kitchens, cleaning the restaurants, getting them ready, and so that we can get the staff home before 9 o'clock. So there's many, sorry to jump off the landlord side, but yeah, there's many options and issues out there with the current item out there. But I just to conclude here, Maurice, we've seen a positive rapport. I'm obviously going to generalize that statement from the landlords at the moment. There are one or two that come out and fight, but I mean that's just the nature of where they are. You'll probably find they are in a very, very, very significant state of affairs from their personal side.
Yeah, I think I just want to jump in here and just mention that this is what Cobra does. So The idea behind Cobra is that you enter the Cobra ecosystem and then we negotiate with qualified mediators, with the banks, with the landlords, with whoever. And I think it's important to mention to the audience, just to give you a bit of law. I don't know if you're aware of this, Wendy, or any of the panelists. There's a new rule that's come out, and so is Rule 41A of the Uniform Rules of Court. And if you get sued, since I think it was March this year when it was promulgated, if you get sued, what has to happen, it's mandatory, there has to be an invitation to mediate as part and parcel of the process. So 41A now makes it obligatory for a landlord to actually try and sit down with you to mediate a solution, or the bank, or whoever. And we actually engage with the banks to put this process in place. So what's now going to happen, and what we're trying to achieve, is that as opposed to the bank just going with legal action and saying, well, you're in default, the bank will approach Cobra and say to Cobra, look, here's a client of ours, let's go into the Cobra environment and let's utilize those mediators. And the idea is that the mediators will strike that solution. The solution, the idea is, will be beneficial to all the way up to the bank level. I want to move to Sean. Sean, I mean, you rose to fame rapidly. I mean, you really, really did well. Where do you sit now, and what is the solution? Are you still scratching your head, or have you come up with some answers?
Hey, Maurice. Well, thanks for having me on today. The short answer is there's no happy end in sight for us. Wendy can attest to this. I think we were all waiting for lockdown to end as a group of restaurateurs across the country, thinking that we would be 2 to 4 weeks behind what was happening in Europe and the rest of the world, where the government trusted the restaurants enough to be responsible environments and provide responsible dining, both for food and bev. And that's obviously not what our government thought of us, and the rules that they put down on us with the no on consumption consumption of alcohol really took us at the knees, So we were hoping to get through those 3 months. We basically white knuckled our way through those 3 months, and then only to be faced with that poison chalice of you can open, but you cannot serve alcohol, So it's and Wendy can probably attest to this, is that the number of restaurant closures post-lockdown compared to during lockdown in terms of level 5 has been astronomically more. So it's been tough for us. There's a saying that hope kills and belief wins. We need to believe that we're going to come out of it, but if you hope for the end of lockdown in terms of level 5, we're going to be able to operate without these restrictive parameters, that would have killed you, as it did a lot of us. So it's been quite a bleak environment for us. And is there end in sight? We don't know. I mean, as Grant said on it, the restaurant survival is basically down to the relationships you have with your landlord and the attitude they take with you. Because if you're allowed to, depending on the size of your store, if you're allowed to mothball your store to a certain extent, you've got a better chance of survival. Whereas if your landlord comes for you for full utilities and a percentage of your rental on a monthly basis, when you're actually not trading like we are not trading in our biggest stores, then the outlook is very bleak.
But is there a plan? Have you put together a plan? Have you thought to yourself, okay, this is a backup plan. If the lockdown carries on past this date, this is what we're going to do? Or is it you finding that everybody's pretty much lost as to what to do because of uncertainty?
Well, it's very hard to put a plan together when you have no engagement from the powers that be. As Wendy said, we've been lobbying and trying to make contact with the government and the various decision makers for feedback as to, number one, what is the rationale behind these parameters that they're putting in place, and number two, when do they envisage or foresee the lifting of these parameters? Only once we have feedback on those two questions can we actually formalize a plan. Right now we don't know. We're the only country on earth that's got a ban on alcohol and a curfew together. And with those two things in place, it's making it difficult to survive, and it's making it very difficult to formulate a plan. I mean, in its simplest terms, you say, I've got X amount of money left in my bank accounts. It's going to cost me X to pay, to piecemeal pay certain landlords, however many landlords you've got, just to keep them happy. Maybe that payment involves a slight contribution towards utilities that they're still invariably charging you, or rates. And then I've got X amount in my bank account. I've got X amount of money to pay per month, and then I can last for another 3 or 4 months. again, it comes down, it's how long is a piece of string. It depends on the attitude of your landlord. It depends on how much staff you've got. It also depends on the size of your restaurant. I mean, if you've got a really big restaurant like we do in Rockets and Bryanston, where our utilities are over 100 grand a month, it makes it difficult to even operate. Whereas if you've got a much smaller restaurant like the Rockets Express, for instance, which is a 60 to 100 square meter store, where our utilities and the overheads are much smaller, you can eke your way through this. But it's very difficult to say, this is my plan going forward, and this is what I envisage, and this is what I'm going to do, when we literally have no feedback and no answers. The minister took the memorandum given to her by Wendy last night. I'm very positive to hear that our president responded, but a response is one thing and action is another. So we need concrete answers in terms of what they envisage and what they foresee to bring us out of this, because right now, as it is, to operate within the parameters that they've given us is it's not feasible. It really isn't feasible.
Desperate situation. Evan, Mead Bakery now, are you seeing the situation through a very different lens because of you won't be as impacted when it comes to the alcohol ban and the curfew, or am I incorrect?
I think morning to everybody, and thank you for having us on the webinar today. I think in considering that, I think directly curfews and liquor as a whole is not a big part of our world. Being a bakery cafe, coffee, croissant, morning time breakfast is really where our business sits in the industry. I think indirectly, the impact is there. It's, in a lot of our locations, we sit next to other restaurants. Where there may be a bar culture or late night evening trading and dinner culture. And it's the devastation of those operations that has, and the feet that would normally go, participate in those locations, that we are seeing definite impact on our businesses. I think it's also consumer the consumer mindset and confidence. I think at the beginning of July, you start to set out a plan. Uncertainty is very much the thing that's killing at the moment, or hurting at the moment, not knowing when and where and how to plan accordingly. But at the beginning of July, I think in all of our minds, we had a very real idea that by the end of July there would be liquor sales in restaurants. And then the announcement earlier on in July, I think that it was just a total sort of morale destroyer. It destroyed any sort of sense of sort of move forward, and put us back a week, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I think the restaurants like Rocket, who rely massively on their liquor sales and participation, I think the just mindsets for operators, that was a big sort of a morale killer, and it's going to take a couple of weeks now to start to rebuild on a forward move as far as the industry is concerned.
Yeah, but I mean, you guys sell bread, so I take it you have not taken as much knock as the trade.
Yeah, we're very fortunate, and
in the situation, and
yeah.
To the extent they won't even use the word privilege.
So you say the last part of that again? I lost you for a second.
No. I was just making up. Let me move on to Peter. Peter, well, I'll mention the audience that Cobra, through its CEO Adam Craker, has put together the following methodology. It's called JUMP, JUMP, and the methodology that Cobra is applying to businesses, to restaurants, is one looks at the following. You either jettison as an option, you either uplift, mothball, or pivot. Peter, are you there? I just want to go through these with you, and I want to get your comments. Again, you're a senior business rescue practitioner. You're on the ground. You're applying this methodology. It's a Cobra methodology. Now let's just look at it. For instance, jettison. Is that an option? Mothball is. Spur mothballed. Can you comment on that? What's happening around the jump methodology and its application in your environment, in the Cobra environment?
Maurice, thanks, and morning, everyone. Yeah, look, one's got to look at, what we know from business rescue. It's exactly as, you can't compare a rocket with a need or whatever. I mean, each restaurant has its own challenges. A restaurant with 500 covers is not going to be able to switch to being majority takeouts overnight, whereas, a restaurant that is 50-50 has got more chance of survival. So one's got to look at each case by case. So on the jettison, we're dealing with one fairly well-known small chain, 4 different name restaurants, fairly well-known in Johannesburg. We've closed down 2. We've taken the premises of one and combined it with the other brand name. And the neighbor next door has been up and running on takeouts. And during this period, we've, managed to get to a fairly reasonable turnover, doing deliveries of prepared meals. The restaurant has a fairly close clientele. And in fact, that's what we say to all the restaurants. It's one of the most critical things. If you are able to, and a lot of restaurateurs have, because they're using online booking systems, if you've got the data of your clientele, even if you're having to shut down at the moment, please do keep the brand alive. And that means, giving people messages. I mean, we've heard from Wendy what the horrors have been with trying to get government over the line. Not a lot of people know that. I mean, I was looking at the latest amendments last night, and it's extremely difficult to work out what you can and can't do. Now, I'm in the industry, not a lawyer, I'm an accountant, but I'm in the industry. So for anybody that's the consumer on the street, they haven't a clue what's happening. So I think from a restaurant point of view, if the plan is to continue and not close down totally, then please keep in touch with the customer base. On the other extreme, of course, the only real way one can lock down is through legal protection of business rescue in terms of Chapter 6. And that does give you the opportunity of freezing everything, taking a bloody big chain and a lock and locking the doors, as similar to what Spurs did or Steers did with advising all the landlords that just weren't going to pay them. It's not only the restaurants that have done that, a lot of retailers have done that. But you can do that quite easily in rescue, because if you follow the process properly as it should be done, the landlord, of course, can't evict you if you want that. On the other hand, as Grant was saying, we have had some very good negotiations with landlords. We've just, on the restaurant I talked about, he's given us 6 months rent-free without any clawback. But it's it's an individual that's got a couple of premises, and he's not desperate for funds because his restaurants are fully paid up. We have agreed that if we're doing takeouts and running that side of the restaurant, then we will fund his services. And equally, we've tied rental on one of the properties purely to turnover. But on the other hand, we've given him the option of, if he finds a tenant who can take over the restaurant and pay him, a monthly rental, then we're happy on 3 months' notice to vacate. So we gave him something, and he's getting his services, and he's given us rent-free for 6 months. So it is a matter of negotiation. In that same chain, we've got another landlord. He had exercised some rights before we went into business rescue, and he's continuing with that. So we're going to land up in court with him, which is a sad situation, because that's just taking good money and throwing it out the window. But be that as it may, one's got to protect, the business. So yeah, Maurice, in summary, each case different. We would look at each of them on their merits. And, when one's got the protection of business rescue, at least you can start a proper negotiation with some leverage on the side of the restaurant owner.
Whilst I've got you on, I'm not going to explain to the audience what post-commencement finance is, and I'd invite the audience to find one of the business rescue in a nutshell webinars, prior webinars that's on our website, and we'll explain what PCF is. But post-commencement finance is very, very important in business rescue. You can raise money And I'd like to ask, what's the attitude been of lenders in relation to lending money to restaurant owners, restaurant businesses?
Maurice, it's the same, across the piece. The banks all have recovery units or business rescue type units. They all call different names. Some of them call them ICU. One of the banks calls it Bucket 3. If a company's already in that category, that's a really sad situation, because the absurdity of these government-backed loans. I was in the UK for 10 years and went through the crash of the late 1990. And the government loan scheme was pretty simple. The banks were authorized to implement them, and they had to manage the process. And there were some penalties if the applicant had, given false information, etc., etc. And what the government did is they said 80% of the loan is covered, fully guaranteed. So the banks were taking a 20% risk. Here, the government said the banks must implement it, but importantly, they must apply their own lending criteria. So if the company's already in default for whatever reason prior to the lockdown or after, the banks are now making the statement that we apply our normal criteria, and if you're in the third worst risk category, the watch list, then the answer is no before we even started. So you can't even get to government to apply for the loan. So it makes an absurdity of the situation. I mean, I think we know that the disbursements under that scheme have been minimal. The banks, though, also remember, yes, a lot of them are, all the big, certainly the big four high street banks, and probably Capitec and Investec as well, are exposed to the restaurant industry or the hospitality industry at large. Now, with the industry going in complete collapse, this is not a situation, and I think Wendy covered this, of, a slow, painful, headed down the slope. This was an overnight, we're closing you down. Now, how the hell can any business, whether you manufacturing widgets or whether you serving up food to customers, no business can withstand that, whether you've got oodles of cash on your balance sheet or not. Obviously, if you've got the cash, then you can eke it out as best you can. But the banks generally at the moment are running scared. They have, in the public domain, stated in the media that they have given allowances. Now, those allowances have helped. Obviously, it's a deferral of loan repayments or pushing out of loans or allowing time on mortgages, etc. And of course, that helps immensely. But don't forget, the banks are also running scared at the moment. I'm not for a minute thinking our banks are on the verge of collapse. But when you've got your turnover looking to drop by 50, 60% in way of interest income or fees, and you are increasing your provisions for bad debt significantly. So you can imagine that all the banks, my partner's in banking, and I mean, she spent a lot of her time rejigging budgets, re-looking at how, to try and save money, because, and staff taking salary reductions, etc., etc. So just bear that in mind. It's the same as Grant said on the landlord side. Don't forget the landlord's also got to pay his services, and if he's funded, he's got to pay his funding costs. So it is a negotiation that's got to take place, and because the banks have these bespoke units, who we're very close to all of them, we tend to get on well with them, but that doesn't mean we don't have a fight. And, you just get somebody in the bank, I'm not knocking the banks, and I've been on that side of the desk. Bank credit officers are generally introverts, and they're generally cautious, and they're risk averse. That's why they're in that position. So put that into the mix. Now they're faced with a restaurateur. What does a restaurateur look like? He generally is extroverted and outgoing. Now put those two people in the same room. He terrifies the banker because he said, no, it'll all be fine tomorrow. Well, of course, the bank will say, no, it won't be. You're in lockdown, for God's sake. So the answer is no. So it is a challenge. I mean, it's not easy, but that's not to say we can't do it. Obviously, in rescue, you have slightly more power because the bank can't touch you and everything's frozen, but you still need access to the funds if you were trading. Now you're not trading because you're not allowed to, so you don't need access to the funds other than to, pay those essential things to keep whatever it is that needs to keep the company alive rather than the restaurant alive, because you're trying to keep the business alive. So yeah, Maurice, long answer, but difficult with the banks at the moment. But we are getting a lot of them on board, but painful.
Yeah, I just want to Thanks for that. I just want to mention that when I mentioned jump, it's actually jump start. Start is the begin again component in the methodology that's being employed by Cobra. And the begin again, I guess, is very much linked to the brand, because you'll retain the brand at some point. And if there's a liquidation, the brand has value. The brand can be sold by the liquidators, and one will start again. But obviously, that's undesirable and ought to be avoided at all costs. To the attendees, please ask questions. We only have 13 minutes left, so we'd like to answer whatever questions you may have. Point of the webinar is that we engage and we deal with specific issues that you may be faced with. I'm going to move over back to Wendy once again. Wendy, there's moving away from the lockdown and the regulations. There's a lot of talk in relation to behavioral economics, and that there's this fear that people will have changed their behavior as a result of the lockdown, that people will, for instance, rediscover home cooking, realize that it's not necessarily worth going to a restaurant where one can have a home cooked meal. Have you found that? Are there any concerns that behavior may change permanently, and that may pose a problem? Wendy?
So I just want to raise something just in respect to the previous comments that were made. And at every webinar and every conversation we have this outline issue where we realize that the pivot of all problems for businesses collapsing is the landlord. So restaurants, businesses can sustain themselves if we didn't have these massive leases and these big rentals. So if we can look at a way of maybe integrating, and we've had conversations with the Shopping Centre Council and SAPOA, but I really think that it is the critical part to the success and failure of a business, the ongoing continuation to trade or the decision to close. So if you've accumulated most of your debt through the landlord, the decision to close is pretty much given. We should really be looking at, to save as many restaurants as possible, outlining any of the other things that we're looking at, is a way to work with the landlords to restructure those leases, and on the back end work with the pension funds and the banks on perhaps doing a moratorium exclusively for the landlords or commercial landlords, and specifically to look at a reduction with government to bring it in at a 2% lending rate, which means that in effect we then get the benefit of being able to keep our businesses open with a 8 to 10% turnover, as all businesses do. So if an anchor tenant can come in at 5% and retailers and the combination of retailers and the shopping centre coming in at 10%, it gives everybody a fair opportunity to resuscitate their businesses and continue to trade in their businesses. So that's one part that's really critical. And if and Sean, I think you can come in here and say, if your rental was affordable at the time, it's not that restaurants don't want to match the turnover. We simply can't. The funding is not there. People have lost their income. Behaviors have changed. Consumers are frightened to come to restaurants. There isn't alcohol, the curfew. There's many factors that go into it. But we will trade through all these conditions because we're resilient as restaurateurs. But we can't trade through it unless there's a platform for us to be able to work with somebody. And at this time, the success of any restaurant that's surviving is the relationship that the restaurant has had with the landlord. So I'm saying I think there's a bigger opportunity here pre-business rescue to rescue yourself out of your lease and the massive rentals and ways of renegotiating. And we've got to have these conversations with the landlords, because if we don't, we're going to close businesses, and it's going to be a very long time before those businesses will be rented out to anybody else to trade in. So I think either take a 10% turnover and try and work with the restaurant to rebuild your shopping centre, keep people occupied in premises. Obviously, you have your rates and taxes and your operational costs on that. But if you just put in the pressure and you're losing restaurants, then there is no relationship between landlords and restaurateurs. And I'm only speaking for restaurants.
Can I come in there?
Sure, Sean.
Wendy, you're exactly right. I mean, I think restaurateurs have an unusual opportunity now to possibly renegotiate their leases, especially those restaurants that have always been on the back foot when it comes to rent and being overcharged by landlords and possibly being a little bit unaware in terms of the escalation and the noose around the neck that 2 or 3 years into your lease, that rental amount is going to be putting on you. Landlords now are faced in a precarious position because they've got one of two possibilities. They either get rid of the tenant who's battling to pay his rent and then are faced with an empty shop because there's, as Wendy said, there's the very, very, very limited supply of people who want to come into spaces right now. Or does the landlord work with the tenant and partner up with them in terms of a turnover-based rental and trade your way through this? I mean, Maurice, to touch on what you said, has the landscape changed for restaurants in terms of patronage and people's desire to go out? 100% it has. It's the fallback and the fallout, so to speak, in terms of people wanting to go out is huge. I think that will lessen as the hysteria around COVID-19, whether right or wrong, starts to dissipate slightly. I think it's at a peak right now, and then people will start to repatronize their favorite places. But that's also only going to happen if we have a government that supports our industry. I don't know if you saw that the UK, in fact, for the whole of August, is giving every single customer that goes to a restaurant £10 off their bill. So the restaurant will deduct £10 off every seated customer's bill. They submit that to the UK government on a weekly basis, and within 5 days, the UK government reimburses that spend to the restaurant. So, I mean, it's a worldwide phenomenon that people aren't patronizing restaurants at the moment, and it's down to governments to get people back in. So not only is it down to governments, but it's down to landlords. So if we don't have help from governments, if we don't have help from landlords, the outlook for our industry is very bleak. But if we have positivity on both those sides, then we'll trade our way out of this.
But Sean, it's almost as if restaurants are imprisoned to the landlords. So there's no flexibility for us actually to even do anything, because the largest expense for us at this time that's hanging over our heads is the rent. So restaurants can't function. We can't bring the energy into our business. We can't get back to doing what we do best because we've got this massive lease, the massive debt. We've got personal liability. We've got surety. We've got all our excess cash tied up in deposits. And it sort of holds us round a noose. Yeah. Which is suffocating the industry in a whole. I think that the landlord, and I understand, I've had a lot of conversation with landlords. I understand. They have bonds, they've got expenses, they've got cleaning staff, security, operation, or whatever. But the reality is that we need to help the landlords at the next level. And somebody's not doing that. Somebody's not doing the job for the landlords. And that is why the impact has been put on us and the pressure for us to perform. And that's why restaurants are simply going, 100K rent, I'm turning 40, 4 months, 400K, 160, shut the doors. And the reality is the more doors we close, the bigger the impact has on the entire food chain. And we well know this, Sean. Each restaurant has 100 added suppliers that live off that restaurant, notwithstanding the staff that are currently employed. And notwithstanding all of that, the more people that fall on the government's balance sheet, the higher the taxes are going to be once we recover from COVID, and the more crime is going to happen in South Africa. And we all need to play a part in this rebuilding of the sector and the economy. And nobody's playing. It's fragmented. The banks are going, shut your doors. I don't know what they're going to do with all the equipment they repossess. The landlords are going, pay your rent or we repossess it. The credit card machines are saying, sorry, we're not going to reduce credit card rates, pay it or we take the credit card machines. There's no willingness to take care of each other through this time. And it's not through lack of passion or purpose or investment or dreams that our restaurateurs are sitting in this. It's through a crisis at no fault of our own that the operation of our restaurants have been so expensive in creating all this debt. And there's nobody looking at the back end to say, right, we'll give you a 5-year interest-free loan, pay back your capex at X and save your restaurant. It will cost us 100,000 Rand to open a single restaurant. And I'm not talking operations like Sean. Sean is an icon. He's got a whole different, beautiful business. But a typical restaurant, those doors have been closed. If we can do a debt relief fund on the excess side and we reopen the businesses with 100K, we can bring those businesses back to life. And, I've got this report, which I'll send on to everybody here. And the research states 16,000 restaurants have shut their doors. So we're in deeper trouble and more hot water than what we anticipated yesterday, actually.
I know Peter wants to make a comment, but before Peter jumps in, I think that's exactly it. It's the lesser of all evils. And I can't think of a lesser of the various evils than actually just negotiating a turnover-based rental. And then off the back of that, an arrangement with the banks. And incidentally, that's exactly what Cobra does. I'm going to hand over to Peter because you wanted to comment on that. And maybe you can also jump in as to how we actually take the landlord in and deal with the bank simultaneously with the landlord and then the restaurant. Peter, you wanted to say something?
Well, Reece, look, I think Wendy's on the button there. I think it would certainly make our life a lot easier if there was pressure from government, because it would then come from two sides. But accepting all that Wendy says, remember a couple of things. First of all, this is a capitalist economy, so market dictates. So landlords that were inflating footfall in the larger malls and charging rents, horrendous rents to all the retailers and to the restaurants as well, can no longer do that because the footfall's not there. Now, we all know some of the big centers are including staff, etc., in the footfall numbers. If we can use this opportunity to negotiate with landlords to go percentage-based of turnover, to reduce, and this will happen over time, but what we don't have is the luxury of time. So I agree with Wendy, some lobbying to government for the landlords in particular, but also don't forget, and in rescue, one can just put a padlock around the door. One can just tell the landlord, sorry, he can't pay. He can't do anything to you if you've suspended his lease, which is quite important. It allows you the time to live this out, obviously horrendously, so staff aren't being paid at the same time. But I won't go on about it because we are running out of time. But, and I'm not here to sell business rescue, believe me, because we try our damnedest, as Marie said, through Cobra to get people through this trouble without having to go into rescue. But it is that protection. But the market will dictate. Landlords are not going to be able to do what they like and treat tenants, the larger malls. We know how tenants are treated in those malls. But by and large, we have had good response from the landlords. There's one or two of them that have been difficult. And generally, those are the rates or the listed property companies that are in trouble themselves. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say, Maurice.
I just want to conclude. Sorry, firstly, Ryan, you've been waiting, but we're out of time. I wanted to get to you, so my apologies for that, but I have no doubt we'll have more of these, and I certainly want you back. You guys have been fantastic panelists. Wendy, I want to align our two organizations, and I just want to say that Cobra is here to serve you, to serve your organization. If you guys need any legal advice, if you need to launch any applications as a lobby group or anything of the sort, we're here for you. And that's the idea. So we can actually approach the industry and we can approach government as a united front. And we certainly welcome it. We're here, we're at your disposal. Thanks.
And I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. So thanks to the panelists, thanks to the attendees. You know what Cobra is about. If you want to know more, www.cobra.org.za or send us an email and we'll immediately respond. So thanks to everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, guys.
We're on tomorrow with our economist Safiso. So join that at 10 o'clock. Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.